Ever get that nagging feeling when an idea you shared with someone seems to, well, blossom, but somehow your part in it just fades?
Yeah, like it's been absorbed somehow.
Exactly. Absorbed that experience, that, sense of having your innovative energy maybe subtly taken. That's what we're diving deep into today.
And we've got quite a collection of materials from a listener here detailing a really complex professional situation. It's almost like an innovation
A
mystery.
whodunit. Yeah. What have we got?
We have emails that sort of lay out a timeline. There's a very detailed case study presenting one side,
Okay.
internal planning documents that maybe hint at strategic intentions, and even these intriguing AI conversation logs.
AI logs. Interesting.
Yeah, and it all centers on the interactions between an innovator, Arviel Simmons, and Brett Johnson, who represents the Altru Institute.
Got it. So it's a rich set of puzzle pieces, and our goal here isn't really to point fingers or assign blame.
No, not at all.
It's more about understanding the core issues, right? We want to examine the evidence that's been presented.
Yeah.
Mm.
And hopefully pull out some valuable insights. What can innovators learn from this kind of situation?
Hmm.
And what are maybe some of those less obvious dynamics in professional collaborations?
Precisely. And as we went through these documents, a few key themes just kept popping up.
Like what?
Well, the potential for what one source actually calls the exploitation of innovation.
Okay.
A really tangible dispute over who owns certain intellectual property, and some pretty relevant questions about leadership styles too within an organization.
Okay, let's get into it then. One of the documents, an email from a group called Tech RVL, it introduced this concept that immediately caught my eye. Charismatic extraction.
Ah, yes, that one.
It even came with a framework. What's the core idea behind that?
Well, what's really insightful about this charismatic extraction idea, this framework, is how it describes a dynamic that can be quite subtle, but potentially really damaging.
Subtle how? It suggests that a leader, someone with a strong, maybe appealing personality, can maybe inadvertently, maybe intentionally absorb the innovative work of others,
Uh-huh.
especially someone in, say, a less powerful position. And the framework points out this isn't always like outright theft.
Right, not obvious.
No, it often happens kind of disguised as enthusiastic collaboration, lots of praise, which can make it really hard for the person whose idea it was to even see what's happening or, to speak up.
That makes sense. It's tricky.
Yeah, and this isn't just about this specific case, right? It highlights a systemic risk, really, in innovation spaces where power dynamics can be exploited. It's something every innovator probably needs to be aware of.
So it's less a smash and grab, more like a slow absorption. What are some of the signs, the key indicators this framework mentions?
It lays out several characteristics. You often see this charismatic leader or figure who's great at building rapport, showering praise on new ideas.
Making the innovator feel valued.
Exactly. But the framework suggests this can be a prelude to the extraction part, where the leader gradually folds the innovator's work into their own projects, maybe subtly shifts the ownership narrative, or takes more and more credit, all while, keeping control over the resources, the decisions.
There's a phrase in that framework, public praise as control, that really stands out.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The idea is that if you publicly praise someone's talent, it ironically makes it harder for them to object later.
Right, because if you're always being told how great you are.
Then raising a concern might look like you're being ungrateful or difficult.
Yeah.
And then there's the manipulation of trust. That initial positive connection gets leveraged, maybe to gain compliance, and fundamentally, there's usually an inherent power imbalance.
Which makes it risky to push back.
Very risky. Could jeopardize your position, your reputation, maybe future opportunities.
And this framework, it was sent to Brett Johnson in an email from this Tech RVL group.
Yes, and the context strongly implies they saw it as relevant to the situation with Arviel Simmons.
Okay, so let's shift then. Let's look at things from Arviel's perspective, based on the materials.
Right.
Who is he? What's his story here? What are his main complaints?
Right. So based on the case study and the emails, Arviel Simmons comes across as, highly skilled. Expertise in AI development, data architecture, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
His main claims really center around a pattern of being underpaid for his work, promises that he says weren't kept, and the unauthorized use or application of his intellectual property.
By Brett Johnson and Altru Institute.
Correct. By Johnson and Altru.
And it sounds like he didn't just, let this slide. The documents mention he actually tried to formalize the working relationship.
He did. And that's a key takeaway right there for anyone maybe listening who has a groundbreaking idea.
Don't just rely on enthusiasm. Yeah.
Exactly. Get it in writing. It's not about, like, not trusting someone. It's just about clarity, protection for everyone involved.
So what did he try to do specifically?
Well, he proactively tried to set up a formal foundation pretty early on. The evidence includes drafts of things like a mutual non-disclosure agreement, a consulting agreement.
Standard stuff.
Right. And even a detailed employment contract proposal. These date back to early 2022.
And what happened with those?
Well, what really stands out, according to Simmons' account, is that none of them were ever actually signed by Brett Johnson.
None.
None. Nor were there any, like, significant alternative proposals put forward by Altru, apparently. This consistent lack of formal written agreements is a really crucial piece here.
Wow. And he was already doing significant work during this time. Even without signed documents, there's mention of a research archive.
Yes, the research archive. It dates back to around March 2022. It looks like a meticulously compiled record of his early work.
What's in it?
Planning documents, summaries of meetings, comprehensive research reports focusing on entities in the blockchain and crypto space.
So the groundwork.
Pretty much the groundwork for what Altru later started calling their BCMG database.
Yeah.
This archive really seems to illustrate the depth and, the scope of his contributions right from the start.
And it wasn't just the database work, right? He seemed to be developing his own distinct concepts, too. This Cardi network sounds like a big idea.
Yeah, the Cardi network is particularly interesting. Simmons envisioned it as a platform to connect professionals in the clean tech sector.
Okay.
His documentation details things like potential monetization strategies, user engagement features. It really demonstrates some advanced strategic thinking, architectural planning.
And knowledge of the clean tech space itself.
Exactly, the very area Altru Institute was operating in. And he reportedly shared this concept with Brett Johnson.
So the clarity of the Cardi plan, it sort of contrasts with his reported experiences with Altru's operations.
It does suggest that, yeah. It strongly implies he possessed and was likely using these high-level conceptual skills while working with Altru, even if the operational side at Altru had issues.
Then there's Nicola, the AI agent. This sounds pretty sophisticated.
It does.
And it seems even Nicola, the AI, had its own assessment of this situation.
Indeed. The logs that detail the development and training of Nicola are quite remarkable, actually. Simmons seems to have been aiming for more than just, a functional tool.
What do you mean?
He seems to have been exploring nuanced understanding, maybe even philosophical reflection within the AI itself, guided by his own paradigms, which he calls symphonics and resonance.
Okay, wow.
And Nicola's logs, as they're analyzed in the case study, apparently show its understanding of the dynamics between Simmons and Altru.
What does it say?
It culminates in a statement suggesting they were using him to, quote, simulate innovation without understanding its construction. And it contrasts utilitarian extraction with recursive resonance.
Utilitarian extraction versus recursive resonance?
From the AI.
From the AI. Now, we don't have time for a deep technical dive into Nicola, but the fact that its logs are reflecting on utilitarian extraction, it suggests Arviel wasn't just building an algorithm. He was building something more.
He was trying to imbue it with a framework for understanding, maybe even critiquing creative processes. It showcases a really advanced level of AI development.
And symphonics, you mentioned that term, it keeps coming up. What exactly is this paradigm? How does it fit in?
So symphonics is described as Simmons's foundational intellectual property. It's presented as this comprehensive philosophical and operational framework, apparently over 770 pages long.
It's 170 pages.
Yeah. He calls it a relational theory of everything. It's positioned as the result of decades of his interdisciplinary research refined through his AI work.
What are the core ideas, roughly?
Well, the core tenets seem to revolve around things like universal relational harmonies, inherent intentionality, recursive evolution, and co-creative participation.
Okay.
Think of it like maybe a musical score. Symphonics is the underlying structure, the harmony that guides the individual, notes his projects.
And the 770 pages show the depth of that foundational structure.
Exactly. And he actually formally presented this to Brett Johnson and another person, Aja Pollitt, in December 2024.
How was that received?
Well, according to the account, Brett's immediate focus shifted to administrative tasks, which reportedly highlights a pretty significant disconnect, in their priorities. It suggests maybe a lack of engagement with this pretty profound conceptual work he was offering.
Right. So that's Arviel's perspective, and it seems supported by a lot of documentation. What about the other side? Brett Johnson and the Altru Institute, how did they respond to these issues?
Initially, Brett Johnson's direct responses, particularly in an email from May 2025, seemed to express confusion. He says something like, "I'm a bit confused about all of this. Can we chat later today?"
Confused. After all the documentation, Arviel apparently said.
Well, yeah. Considering the extensive documentation Simmons had already provided by that point, claiming confusion, it seems, let's say, unlikely to be entirely genuine.
Could be seen as a way to avoid the issues.
It could certainly be interpreted that way, yeah. A way to avoid directly addressing the substantive points being raised.
A case study definitely leans that way. What else do the documents suggest about Altru's perspective or Brett Johnson's responses?
Analyzing his email replies, they often have a tone that, well, it could be perceived as evasive, maybe dismissive.
Like how?
For instance, in response to Simmons sending a detailed accounting of hours and issues, Brett apparently asked for a summary under 100 words.
Under 100 words for something this complex.
Right. It feels like a way to minimize the whole situation. There are also instances of what you might call backhanded compliments.
Okay. But what about their internal view? Did they see value in his work?
Well, that's where the internal planning documents are revealing. Things like the Blockchain Project Operating Plan from March 2022 and the Davos Carbon Summit Concept Document from late 2023. These clearly show Altru had commercial objectives for these projects.
Commercial objectives. Interesting for a nonprofit.
Potentially, yeah. And crucially, in those documents, Mr. Simmons is explicitly named as Director of Technology.
Director of Technology. So internally, they absolutely recognized his senior role and the commercial potential.
It certainly looks that way from the documents provided.
But this wasn't reflected in his pay or the formal agreements he was asking for?
That appears to be the core of the disconnect, yes. And while Brett Johnson did send an apology email later, April 30th, 2025.
With an apology? For what?
Acknowledging financial constraints, managerial shortcomings, things like that.
But how did Simmons view that apology?
Well, Simmons apparently sees those admissions as maybe self-serving, like not really getting to the heart of the matter, the inadequate compensation and the alleged use of his IP without proper agreement.
Okay, let's drill down into those key dispute areas. Compensation, that sounds like a major sticking point.
It really is. Simmons initially proposed an hourly rate, $35 an hour. It was apparently verbally negotiated down to $25. But the evidence presented suggests inconsistencies, significant underpayment compared to the hours he logged.
And it got weird, right? Like grocery money.
Yeah. There are mentions of sporadic payments described as grocery money, and even some payments categorized as loans.
Loans, that just muddies the water completely.
It really obscures the actual financial arrangement, yeah. Makes it hard to track what was payment for work versus something else.
And the intellectual property dispute, obviously central.
Absolutely central. You have Simmons's foundational work on that BCMG database.
Right.
The development of the AI agents, Nikola, and another one called Hydro Gumshoe, and then his whole overarching symphonics paradigm.
All significant IP.
Definitely constitutes significant intellectual property. And crucially, the lack of any signed IP agreements really strengthens Simmons's claims regarding ownership.
What about his role, his position? You mentioned Director of Technology internally.
Yes, those internal planning docs clearly assign him that senior leadership role. But that title and the responsibilities that likely came with it, they just don't seem to match up with his actual compensation, his formal status, given the unsigned contracts, or, frankly, any public acknowledgement of his contributions that we can see in these materials.
And the fact that Altru Institute is a nonprofit, that adds another layer here, doesn't it? Ethical considerations.
It does. The allegations raise questions about, the potential use of innovation developed perhaps under their umbrella for commercial purposes, all within a nonprofit structure, potentially without fairly compensating or recognizing the person whose expertise and IP were allegedly key to it all.
The timeline seems important, too. How did this whole thing unfold over time?
Yeah, the timeline analysis in the case study is pretty revealing. It shows this progression. Starts with the initial engagement, the attempts to formalize things that go nowhere.
The unsigned contract.
Right. Then you see an increasing scope of work, often without clear agreement on pay adjustments. Then the consistent inconsistencies in payments, the alleged disregard of his symphonics framework when he presented it, and ultimately the complete breakdown of the relationship.
And the timeline highlights specific instances of evasion.
It details specific examples attributed to Brett Johnson: alleged evasiveness, misrepresentation, omissions. Things like not finalizing that initial agreement, making promises of funding that apparently didn't come through, and seeming to downplay Simmons' fundamental role in these projects.
Okay. So, based on all this evidence presented in the materials, what kind of overall picture emerges of Brett Johnson's approach? His character, maybe?
Well, based solely on the evidence we had here, Brett Johnson comes across as possibly quite visionary, ambitious.
Big ideas.
Big ideas, definitely. But maybe operationally challenged. He seems to prioritize enthusiasm, maybe verbal assurances, over nailing down the formal, essential bits of professional collaboration.
Like contracts.
Like contracts, yeah. There's a discernible pattern, it seems, of apparent evasiveness, especially around financial accountability. And he also seems inclined towards expanding project scope, maybe shifting goals, without adequately managing expectations or, critically, the compensation side of things.
It's a pattern that highlights a lesson, maybe.
I think so. That pattern really underscores a critical point.
Yeah.
Having a compelling vision isn't enough, right? Operational excellence, ethical follow-through, those are just as crucial for sustainable innovation.
Absolutely. And what about RVL Simmons? What picture emerges of him from these documents?
Simmons comes across as, well, clearly highly skilled, deeply innovative. Seems quite mission-driven, too. Initially, he showed a willingness to compromise, actually, and a fair amount of patience.
But also meticulous.
Very meticulous in his record-keeping, it appears. Proactive in trying to get those formal agreements in place, and resilient facing these challenges.
Did his approach change over time?
The timeline suggests, yeah, a growing assertiveness as things went on, which makes sense. And alongside that, clear concerns about the ethics of how Altru was operating.
And the philosophical side?
Yeah, his development of symphonics, those thoughtful interactions with the AI Nicola, it points to a deep philosophical thinker, and someone who was clearly significantly affected, emotionally perhaps, by this whole experience.
Okay. So let's try to bring all these threads together now. What are the key conclusions we can draw from this deep dive into these materials?
Well, I think our analysis points pretty strongly towards substantial evidence presented by RVL Simmons, evidence detailing his significant contributions to Altru. It also points to the alleged failures on the part of Brett Johnson and Altru to fairly compensate him, to acknowledge his work properly.
And that charismatic extraction idea.
And the potential relevance, yeah, of that charismatic extraction framework in maybe understanding the dynamics that were at play here.
Looking back through it all, were there any specific aha moments for you, things that really stood out?
There were several, actually. That internal recognition of Simmons as director of technology that contrasted so sharply with his reported pay and lack of a contract, that was definitely an aha moment.
What else?
The clear commercial intentions behind projects he was so involved in, that was notable. Also, the sophistication of his AI work, hinted at by Nicola's logs, that was impressive.
Right.
And maybe the starkest contrast was how his big idea, his foundational symphonics paradigm, was received compared to the immediate focus on admin details by Brett Johnson. That was quite telling.
So thinking about our listener, or really anyone involved in innovation collaboration, what should they take away from this? What are the crucial things to be mindful of? Maybe steps to protect themselves, ensure ethical practices?
I think this situation just hammers home the vital importance of formalizing agreements right from the start.
Get it in writing.
Get it in writing. Clearly outline the scope of work, the compensation terms, crucially, the intellectual property rights. It needs to be clear up front.
And beyond contracts.
Be acutely aware of power dynamics, always, in any professional relationship. And recognize that even environments that seem really supportive and enthusiastic, they can potentially become exploitative.
So watch for red flags.
Exactly. Pay close attention to consistent delays or outright refusals to sign contracts. Look for discrepancies between the responsibilities you're given and the compensation you agreed on. And any lack of transparent communication, especially about money and ownership, those are all potential red flags.
That's incredibly valuable advice, really practical stuff. As we wrap up here, what's a final thought you'd like to leave our listener with? Something for them to chew on?
Maybe think about the broader implications of this charismatic extraction idea, beyond just formal work settings.
How so?
How might similar dynamics play out in other parts of life? And what's the real significance of recognizing and actually addressing these power imbalances if we want to foster truly equitable, truly innovative endeavors? Perhaps, reflect on your own experiences, your own observations. Have you ever encountered situations like this or seen them happen? And what were the outcomes?
Definitely something to reflect on. This has been a really compelling, intricate deep dive. Some truly significant lessons in here for all of us, I think. Thank you for guiding us through it.
My pleasure. It's complex stuff.
And to our listener who shared these materials, we really hope this thorough exploration has offered some clarity, maybe some deeper understanding. This has been the deep dive.